Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome H.W. Brands and T.J. Stiles.
Well, I'm going to speak first because I started first. Um, we're going to be having a conversation about two people whose lives intersected and interwove, and yet since Custer was very much the junior officer and the junior figure, um, Grant was a much bigger figure in Custer's life than Custer was in Grant's, and yet the contrast and the interplay between them says so much about the times, and so I'm going to throw the throw the mic back, so to speak. But one interesting thing I would note is that for two men who are so different in style and in politics, in generalship, they both started off in very similar circumstances. They were both born poor in Ohio, and the sons of struggling artisans, and that their lives took such different courses is absolutely fascinating. And so I'll hand it off to Bill Brands to talk about a little bit about Grant, and then maybe we can get a discussion about the
Yes, and I hope we
two
can
figures.
bring in the audience at some convenient point.
Yeah.
I'd first of all say thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be back at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. I have to say, it is about the best writers festival in the country in terms of the organization, in terms of the authors. I'll leave my... Okay. Thank you. Thanks for coming. But the Rancho Mirage is a great writers festival, and speaking as an author, I can say that it's a delight to come and have conversations with people like T.J. Stiles and have audiences like you. So on to the question that T.J. put in my direction. So Grant, I'll talk a little bit about Grant's origins. I'm not going to go into his childhood or his genealogy, although people who write about figures like Grant often do. But what I'm going to get at is I'm going to explain why I wrote about Ulysses Grant and what I found particularly fascinating, why I find him illuminating, and I'd be interested to see how much of this applies to Custer as well. To me, the striking thing about Grant is that there was almost nothing in his upbringing, even nothing in his young adulthood, that would identify him as the great hero on the Union side of the Civil War. There was almost nothing in Grant that said this guy has a genius for military command. And he himself didn't know it. He was a reluctant soldier in the first place. He was basically sent off to West Point by his father, who wanted to get him out of the house and figured that, okay, we can send him off. And when Grant was heading off for West Point, he was coming from Ohio, and it was his first time on a train. And he thought this was pretty exciting, but he kept thinking en route that he was hoping that maybe there would be something that would spare him from actually having to be a soldier. So maybe the train would get in a wreck and he would be mildly injured and he would be disqualified for service. It would have served the purpose of getting him out of the house. But anyway, I'm not going to go into much further detail with that, but to say that one of the things that struck me about Grant was the fact that he didn't know he was going to be a great soldier. He didn't particularly want to be a soldier at all. And furthermore, and this is the most intriguing part, Grant to me is a type example of someone, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit, but only a little bit, someone who wasn't good at anything else in life except being a soldier. And he was really good at being a soldier. And the reason that this is so intriguing to me is that a question that I pose to my students, and I have for many years now, and I'll put the question to you, and that is, why do wars happen? Why do countries go to war? Why do societies go to war? And generally speaking, the answers to this question break down into sort of two categories. One is war is when things go wrong. And this is the comforting notion that most Americans like to think about our own country, that there are bad people out there who screw up, and we go in and fix it up. We repair things, and we generally operate on the principle that whatever war we're in is maybe going to be the last war. At least if we fix this, then we'll all get back to doing what we want to do, and that is whatever it is that makes us healthy and happy and prosperous and all that stuff. So one category of answer is war is when things go wrong. There's another possible category of answers, and that is war is when things go right. There is something positively appealing about war. And when I look at somebody like Grant, when I look at somebody like William Sherman, when I look at somebody like Robert E. Lee, perhaps Custer, war is what makes these people famous. I never would have written a biography about Ulysses Grant had he not been a soldier. I dare say, Custer had not been a soldier, he wouldn't have received the attention that he had. And so, war makes heroes. And people can be drawn to that heroic part of it. There's also the excitement of war. There is the thrill of going off and doing this great thing. For most people who go off to war, who fight in wars, they realize at the time, they're often told by the rest of society, this is the biggest deal you will ever do. What is it that the generation that fought in World War II has managed to call itself? The greatest generation. It's quite a striking statement because World War II was the most disastrous war in human history. But the generation that fought there is the greatest generation. I'll let you.
Well, that's okay. Am I supposed to take a stand on whether they are or not? I'm not sure. Well, it's very interesting. You know, Tolstoy wrote in War and Peace that Napoleon only imagined that he had ordered the invasion of Russia. That in fact, he taking the idea of, you know, whether it's the great man who runs history or larger forces, he took it to the extreme and said it was actually because millions of Frenchmen were willing to do this, that millions of Frenchmen wanted to have a war with Russia. That's the only reason he could maintain the illusion of command. Now, that takes it to an extreme, and yet the American Civil War illustrates very much how, you know, this great traumatic conflict, which historians now believe, there's been very good research that suggests at least 750,000 people died in the Civil War, more than we used to estimate. So this is an incredibly devastating event. And yet it happened because the mass of American people wanted to do it. Now, what's interesting about both Custer and Grant to me is that the war brought together trends in American history that are exemplified in these two men. One is there's an older America that is very much an unprofessional, unspecialized, uninstitutionalized America. And Custer and Grant are both products of the opposite. They're a product of professional training. And that while West Point's professional training is not the level it is now, only 1% of white American men went to college before the Civil War. And those colleges tended to produce gentlemen. They studied, you know, what we now say is a liberal education. West Point was, in fact, a professional military and engineering school. And this is a rarity in America at that time. So they go into the Civil War, despite the fact that they both had troubled careers. Custer graduated in 1861. They graduated 2 classes that year. Last in his class, but first in demerits. And immediately upon graduating, he was court-martialed and convicted. And yet, it was a minor offense. They had a lot of court-martials for all levels of offense back then. He went off to war, and yet he'd had this professional education. And Grant as well, not a distinguished student at West Point, I think it's safe to say,
Right.
And yet he'd had this professional military education. So you've got the professionals who know how to construct an army, know how to conduct a siege, how to position troops for battle, et cetera, et cetera. And yet you've got a mass army. This is America under arms. There's actually 2 armies, the regular army and the U.S. volunteers, which are raised by the states. And so it's a very political war, political in the sense of, you know, communities are organizing companies. States are organizing regiments. Originally, men are electing their own officers. And so you've got these 2 men with very different political views. In 1860, Custer, right before the Civil War, Custer wrote letters saying, you know, it's awful, Lincoln should never be elected, condemning John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry, basically using the language of secessionists. And so he was from a border state family, Southern Ohio. His father was from Maryland. This is a region which, you know, to this day is very conservative, very, you know, it's kind of a part of a continuum with Southern culture, very much Southern-oriented in their cultural and political views. And this very much separates him and will later create tension with Grant. and yet he's also a unionist in that kind of clay tradition of border state, unionists, no matter how conservative he is politically. And so he goes off to war as a junior officer, the most junior officer, having graduated last in his class. And he's off set to rise. He loves war in a way that Grant doesn't. He's a tactical officer all through the war. He's in the midst of combat. And the way that he rises and the way that Grant rises is very interesting because Custer is a young officer who has merit that you don't anticipate from the way he died. And yet he also is someone who is working the political angle. Politics within the Army, seeking patrons to rise within the U.S. Volunteers, and also demonstrating his merit. And so the contrast between their styles and the way they rise, the way they conduct themselves on the battlefield is very interesting because it sort of reflects different aspects of America in this transitional period.
Yeah.
I mean, Grant's rise is astonishing, actually.
It is. I want to pick up on something you said earlier, you and Tolstoy, about how the reason that there was a war between France and Russia is that all these Frenchmen wanted to go fight against Russia. And I think that's true. But they have to be mobilized, they have to be incentivized to do this. When I talk to my students, and when I asked about this question, why is there war, I look at my students, who are much younger than you, and I point out to them that they are the age of soldiers throughout history. And I explain that decisions for war typically come in two stages. And the way I put it is, people like me, meaning people of my generation, we get together in Washington, to take the American example, and for one reason or other, national interest, ambition, whatever it is, we decide, let's go to war. But we never mean let's us go to war. We mean let's, and now I point to my students, let's you go to war. And so the question that comes up in every war is, once the leaders have made the decision we're going to go to war, why, I ask my students, why do you agree? Why do you go along with it? And I cannot think of a good war, and if somebody can come up with a counterexample, I'd love to hear it, of a case where the national leaders said, let's go to war, and the soldiers, the potential soldiers, said, no, let's not. Now, it is true that some wars get unpopular toward the end, but the Civil War is a very good example. So, when the fighting begins, then Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet decide, well, they're going to resupply Fort Sumter, the fighting begins. And it's that moment that Lincoln has to appeal to the American people. And he calls for 75,000 volunteers, and he gets 150,000. And the American people have decided this is something we need to do. When I say the American people, young people who are of an age to fight. And a question is, why do they do this? They do it for a variety of reasons. TJ said that can I share that you're working on Theodore Roosevelt?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
so he's working on Teddy Roosevelt. And Roosevelt's a very good case. One of the reasons that Roosevelt goes off to war is he feels he personally has something to prove, that his father let down the Union side by not putting on the uniform during the war. So young men, until very recently, pretty much only been young men, they have multiple reasons for going to war, but they have to sort of get pointed in the direction. So then you start talking about the sort of the rise of Custer and the rise of Grant. Grant was probably as surprised as anyone that he rose as quickly as he did. And for somebody like me who's trying to figure out what was it that made Grant we'll call him the military hero if you think that the Union victory is a good thing, at least anyway, who became the commanding general of the Union side. What was it that conduced to his success? And, if you look at, there's certain intellectual aspects of military leadership, especially in those days, that are different from today. So Grant was not political, but Grant had a kind of visual, almost artistic sense, an imagination that allowed him to do something that's not so important today, at least not in the same way as it was back then. In those days, war was a very two-dimensional kind of thing. There was almost no ability to get above the battlefield and see where the opposing forces lay, where your own troops were, where the other troops were, how they fit into the lay of the land. But Grant could look at a map, Grant could look at the order of battle and see where the various people were, and figure out where they were, where the enemy was or would be, and what the connection with the two sides and the land was. So that was part of his ability. But the key thing, And this is what finally led Lincoln to choose Grant over the other 5 generals who had preceded him, was that Grant had an ability that, when I think about it, and again, when I pose it to my students, I say, this is a trait in military leadership that I find, and maybe you do too, find almost simultaneously admirable and appalling. And that is the ability to give the order to start the battle, give the order to fight, knowing, and certainly by the second year of the Civil War, knowing that you give the order and thousands of young men are going to be dead in the next few hours. And Grant could walk around his camp the night before a battle, the night before an attack, and he knew statistically that among the young men that he was speaking to, a whole lot of them were going to be dead by noon the next day. And he could still give the order. And I say that that's simultaneously, at least to me, admirable and appalling. Admirable in that if you're going to have wars, you have to have people willing to do it. And this is why ultimately the Union side won the Civil War. But it's appalling. Just let me finish it.
Oh, sure,
I mean, it's appalling in the sense that it requires the general, and one could say the President Abraham Lincoln hiring somebody like Grant, to do something we are all usually encouraged from the earliest age not to do. And that is to let the end justify the means. So the end is holding the Union together. Eventually the end is ending slavery. But the means is knowing that these 750,000 people are going to die in all of this. And, and to give that order.
Well, it's an interesting point because, the Civil War is an existential political conflict. The Confederacy is fighting to exist. It's either going to exist or not. That the national government is fighting to maintain the United States, maintain the Republic or not. So the point of the war is it's going to be won by convincing the other side it's utterly pointless, which means that it requires really to, based on our experiences, who didn't live through the Second World War, kind of a shocking level of ruthlessness is required. And Grant is so fascinating because he himself is a gentle person. He is appalled. His displays of anger are mostly when he sees people mistreating animals. And yet he has this ruthlessness, this willingness to see where things are going, what must be done, and the willingness to do it. Now, Custer is fascinating because he came up as a protege of the opposite, who's George McClellan. And Custer actually is a contrast to your well-taken point. One of his things he does in the Peninsula Campaign is he serves as one of history's first aerial military observers in a balloon, which again is the side of the kind of the new technology that's coming about. Now, balloons don't move very fast, but neither did McClellan, so that worked out okay. And what's interesting is that personally, he was such a contrast in McClellan. He was a dashing, daring young man, and yet politically, he was very much of the same mind as McClellan, who believed not just in a limited war, but did not want to disrupt slavery, who wanted to restore the Republic as it was. And this actually creates great problems because McClellan was constantly, not only was he reluctant to engage in battle, reluctant to even manage battles, except for Antietam. All his battles were managed tactically by subordinate commanders. And yet he was intriguing with leaders of the Democratic Party, the political opposition to the commander-in-chief. This is something that Custer very much imbibes, and at the end of his life gets him in trouble with Grant. And yet he rises because he, too, is willing to see through the war. He wants to win. So he's politically conservative. He has a kind of an antebellum romanticism that the war is murdering. And yet he rises. He survives McClellan's downfall by finding a new patron in the Army. He goes from McClellan's staff to the staff of Alfred Pleasonton, who becomes commander of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac, the main Eastern Army. And then because Joseph Hooker falls during the invasion of the North by Lee in 1863, then Pleasonton gets a chance from Meade to appoint his own brigade commanders, and he appoints 3 young officers from his personal staff. So Custer, at the age of 23, remember he graduated last in his class at West Point, but first in demerits. He becomes a brigade commander, a brigadier general at the age of 23. And he goes straight into battle. He goes straight into the Gettysburg. He literally fights a battle his first day. He plays a key role in the cavalry battle on the East Cavalry Field at Gettysburg. And he displays traits that are at odds with the way Grant fights as a higher level commander and with the way in which the culture is gradually changing, the way fighting is changing, in that he is playing the role of the dashing romantic leader on the battlefield. Now, there's a reason why that actually works for him. Again, it's a two-dimensional battlefield in which command and control is through sight and sound. So you see your leader on the field, he's wearing this outrageous black velveteen costume, but he, unlike Grant, he's leading charges, he's in the mix. He's in the cavalry, which has lower level of manpower. They're fighting at close range, literally with sabers. Custer may be the last American general to kill someone in a sword fight. His men love that. And it's a kind of fighting in which that old-fashioned romantic cavalier style actually plays to his benefit. If he'd been an infantry commander, he would have been slaughtered in a charge early on. But the cavalry fighting mostly other cavalry, he succeeds. And as the war goes on, he becomes a favorite of Sheridan, was one of Grant's favorites, because he's an effective battlefield tactical commander, and he wants to win the war, as conservative as he is. And yet you see with Grant, he's often been compared, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about this. Again, he's at a higher level, but he's often been called the first modern general. He's managing these battles. He's not crafting brilliant tactics and leading charges and affecting this daring style. He's seen as more like the soldier's general, the kind of the man who's going to see it through whatever the results of the day's battle are. He's seeing the big picture.
Yeah. So the comparison that is often made is between Grant and Robert E. Lee. And those people who pride themselves on their grasp of military history often prefer Lee. I think mistakenly, but Lee is a little bit more along the lines of Custer, sort of making more of less, and as the underdog, he has to engage in more tactical maneuver. Even keeping the Army of Northern Virginia together as long as he does is quite a feat. And Grant suffers by comparison on this particular score, but that misses the point, because Grant understood something, and you've alluded to it. He understood that the point of war is to win, and especially in the Civil War, the point of the war for the North was to convince the South that it could not survive. It could not continue the war. And so Grant realized quite early on that his war was going to be a war of attrition. He didn't have to do anything fancy. He simply had to grind down the other side. He did it sort of with his own armies directly, going against Lee from 1864 to the beginning of 1865, because he understood by that time that in a battle where both sides lost, let's say each side lost 5,000, 10,000, every one of Grant's troops could be replaced. By the middle of 1864, essentially none of Lee's troops could be replaced. And with that arithmetic, he simply had to stay in the field and he was going to win. He also understood the importance of taking the war to Southern civilians. And this is what led him to unleash William Sherman upon the South. The whole point of Sherman's march to the sea, his march through Georgia to the sea, basically sweeping a path of destruction 60 miles wide across Georgia, was to convince the South that if they kept fighting, convince Southern civilians that if they kept fighting, this was going to happen to the whole South. And so this question of what is the war for and what does it result in Grant's case in particular, basically dictates the style. I want to pick up on something else that TJ said, and Custer is definitely an extreme example of this. Someone for whom war proves, call it the ultimate meritocracy, because he's the least promising guy, as we just heard, coming out of West Point, but very quickly, by what age, 23, 24?
23.
He's a brigadier general. Yeah. And this is, I think, one of the appealing things about war, both for individuals, because if you can do it, then you can rise. Grant eventually leaped over hundreds of senior officers, and Grant had this track record, this history long remembered in the regular army of having drunk himself out of the army several years before. And nobody wanted him back particularly, but they needed officers. And ultimately, Lincoln needed somebody who could fight. on this general topic, I'm getting back to the overall question of what's the appeal of war? Why do they happen so often? Why does every society go to war and make a big deal of warriors? And in the case of American history, it's clearly demonstrated during the Civil War that war makes certain things possible that are impossible, at least were impossible during peacetime. And I'll give you the single most striking example of this period. From 1776 or 1789, take your pick, until 1861, the American political system had not figured out what to do about slavery. It could not figure out how to reconcile slavery in a republic. And the politicians went at it for generation after generation. And the problem was as vexing in 1860 as it had been in 1789. So we have 70 years where the political system cannot answer the question, what are we going to do about slavery? Within 3 years, 2.5 years, after the beginning of the war, the answer is possible. Because Abraham Lincoln, under the auspices of the war, in his exercising his authority as commander-in-chief, can, here the metaphor is almost literally true, can cut the Gordian knot of slavery. This is what war allows you to do. One of the reasons that I wrote about Ulysses Grant was not simply that he was a soldier, but that he was also a politician. And I wanted to draw out, examine, and then elaborate the distinction between war and peace. So Grant had a great Civil War. He was well suited to war, but also war allowed things to be done that couldn't be done in peacetime. But then he was president during Reconstruction. Now, I happen to think that Grant was a much better president than he's often given credit for being, but he's never going to make the top ranks of presidency because the 10 years after the Civil War were the hardest time in American history to be president. Reconstruction was going to break anybody's presidency. Why is that? Because in contrast to the period of the war, where you can use the instruments of coercion, once war ends and you shift back to politics, all you've got is persuasion. And persuasion comes a lot harder than coercion does.
Well, I would actually want to take a little bit of issue with that in the sense that, you know, at the end of the war, the South is being held in a legal sense in the grasp of war. And so the military becomes by default, and also because it's the only tool the federal government had, but also because of the fact that, you know, the South has been in a state of rebellion and insurrection, the military becomes the primary tool for the South the federal government trying to reshape the South. And so that does become a part of the controversy in that, you know, this gets to be called an occupation. The federal government did not have the administrative capacity to deploy anything but the military in the South. And Reconstruction gets driven ahead by this fascinating process in which Custer is very much on the opposite side from Grant. They both go on Andrew Johnson's Swing Around the Circle in 1866. This is a campaign tour against the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the proposed 14th Amendment, which was ratified 150 years ago this year, against this revolution which is emerging in response to former Confederates who are lashing out at the self-assertion of the freed people in the South, who are forming schools, who are leaving their old masters to find work elsewhere and to find family, who are forming political clubs, and there is a violent reaction which manifests itself in mass attacks on black people in New Orleans and Memphis and elsewhere. And Custer, being from that old political tradition, having been very much wanting to win the Civil War at all costs, his old conservative views come to the fore. And interestingly, they go on this tour. Grant kind of gets roped into it, I think it's safe to say. Yeah. Grant leaves early, he wants nothing to do with it, and he moves more and more in the pro-civil rights direction, which marks his presidency. Custer is out on the platform with Andrew Johnson making political speeches. He actually organizes, he's a political convention of soldiers and sailors to support Johnson. He's a serving army officer throwing himself into politics. And this becomes a very interesting tension between the two of them. Now, Custer's a minor figure politically, but he keeps resurfacing to support opposition to civil rights. Grant creates civil rights enforcement. And Custer actually gets deployed to Kentucky in 1871 to 73, where the Ku Klux Klan was operating really as the illicit arm of the state government in Kentucky, which was not under the Reconstruction laws. And Custer is having to order troops to go out and help arrest Klansmen who are murdering freed people in Kentucky, et cetera. He hates it. He wants nothing to do with it. And Grant, meanwhile, is having to push his cabinet to try to enforce civil rights. Now, interestingly, you know, they both obviously are involved in American Indian policy. We want to leave some time for questions, so I won't go into that. But at the end of Custer's life, he comes to Grant's attention again because after the midterm election of 1874, one of the most momentous midterms in American history, that 1866 being another, that the Democrats have taken back the House of Representatives. And they use that control of that branch, of that House, to launch a series of politically motivated investigations. And they use a real issue, corruption, as a way of undermining Reconstruction, the federal government's attempts to enforce civil rights in the South, to undermine the whole idea of the federal enterprise in trying to reshape the South. And Custer goes to Capitol Hill. He testifies before one of these houses. He's writing one of these committees. He's writing letters, secretly articles under a pseudonym for the New York Herald. He's writing letters at the table of the Democratic leadership. He's a lieutenant colonel in the regular army. And he's having lunch openly with the leaders of the political opposition to the commander-in-chief. It infuriates Grant, and I think correctly. And so, ironically, in the Great Indian Campaign of 1876, in an attempt to get the Sioux to cough up the Black Hills and to break their resistance to American power, federal power in the Northern Plains, Custer gets pulled off the command of his column of the 7th Cavalry by Grant, who's infuriated with him. And he has to beg and plead, and he gets his commanders to beg and plead. And finally, you know, reluctantly, Grant allows him to go on command. So Custer nearly saved himself by his political machinations. But it illustrates the resistance to the people who aren't persuaded in the North as well as in the South, and how this great experiment in racial equality gets cut short. And so Custer is not a major player, though he's high profile. And his fight with Grant illustrates, you know, the fight that ultimately stops Reconstruction and stops civil rights for a couple of generations, I think.
Yeah. So TJ was referring to Grant's efforts against the Ku Klux Klan. So in the early 1870s, Grant realizes that something has to be done to break up the Klan. And he persuades Congress to pass a force bill, sometimes called the Ku Klux Klan Act, that allows him to suspend habeas corpus and arrest all sorts of people in several counties of South Carolina where the Klan was centered. It was the most successful campaign against the Ku Klux Klan in American history. But Grant recognized you could do that just about once. He probably couldn't do it again. He understood that there was increasing resistance in the South and increasing exhaustion in the North at the idea that the national government was going to manage the affairs of the southern states. And the resistance in the South rose, the exhaustion in the North increased, and essentially Reconstruction ended of exhaustion and the resistance. And Grant recognized that the Reconstruction began with the South under military occupation, but absent a war, the United States does not occupy its own states. This was a wasting asset that was going to waste away, as it did. So, you know, the best that can be said about Grant's presidency, I don't want to say the best, but maybe the most common good thing that can be said about Grant's presidency was he had good intentions and he was kind of fighting a strong current going the other way, both on Reconstruction, both on policy toward Native Americans. Should we take questions?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Okay,
yeah.
so if you have a question, please speak it aloud, and you can address it to either me or TJ, and we will repeat it so it can be recorded. Yes?
Raised in the South as I was, a lot of my friends claimed that the Civil War was not about slavery.
So the question was, he said being raised in the South, he grew up with the widespread view that the Civil War is not about slavery. I think, and you correct me if you disagree, the way to put it, we could go on for another hour about this, is that secession was all about slavery, and that the federal government went to war to stop secession, and that the process of the war, and I would argue the enslaved people themselves made the war about slavery during the course of the war. So if you read the secession ordinances and you read all the political debate, the debate that led to the Civil War was about slavery, but it wasn't about whether slavery would be abolished in the South. It was about a fight over whether slavery would be expanded to new territories in the West, and whether the North would have to return escaped slaves. One of the biggest expansions of federal power at the expense of states before the Civil War was the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, passed at the insistence of Southerners. And so slavery was the central issue in the Civil War, but yes, you can certainly say the federal government, it had no legal grounds to go to war against the South to eliminate slavery. And in fact, many people, including McClellan and Custer and others, went to war, firmly opposed to secession, but not wanting to get rid of slavery. The war itself made it a war aim.
I'd like to elaborate on that just a little bit. So it is true that if you look at most of the Southern ordinances of secession, they state very clearly that slavery, this essential institution for the South, is a grave risk because the nation has elected what they haven't called the Black Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln. And so therefore, for the security of slavery, we must leave. In some cases, this, however, was the crisis du jour. South Carolina had been threatening to leave the Union for 3 decades. And the most recent sort of serious case was in 1832 and 1833, and it wasn't over slavery at all. It was over taxes. There was a tariff that South Carolinians, led by John Calhoun, thought was regionally tilted against them. And there were people in South Carolina and some other southern states who were almost looking for an excuse to leave the Union. One of the reasons that Abraham Lincoln didn't get on the ballot in any of the southern states was that there were people in the South who wanted Lincoln to get elected, precisely so they could say, now we will leave. But I want to go back to this question of the two-level decision for war. Because, and I do this with my students, when you look at why Jefferson Davis, why the leaders of the Confederacy made the decisions they did, and you go through every Confederate state, there are these leaders, and they say, okay, we have to leave the Union for these reasons. But then if you go and ask, so who actually goes to war? Who are the soldiers who go to fight for the Confederacy? The decisions made by the governments were driven by the slave-holding interest. So these are the planters who dominated the politics of every southern state. But the soldiers, the rank and file in the Confederate Army, were not slaveholders. So if you were a young man in Texas, where I live, or South Carolina or Georgia, and you went off to fight, if you were one of that large majority of southern whites who didn't own slaves and would never own slaves, and somebody asks you, what are you fighting for? Well, you can read their letters, and almost none of them say, I'm fighting for slavery. They say, I'm fighting to defend Virginia, or defend Georgia, or South Carolina. We have been invaded by this foreign force. They considered that they were doing what George Washington and the Continental Army did in the 1770s and 1780s. They were fighting in defense of their rights in their homeland. So in terms of why was there a Civil War, it was about slavery. It was about states' rights. It was about everybody else in my town. TJ pointed out, the Civil War was fought in very large part by these community groups that would go join the local regiment. They went off to war because their buddies went off to war, and they didn't want to be left behind as the one who was too cowardly to go to war.
I have a little bit different view on that. Having written about Jesse James and his political views, I think that the whole political fight before the Civil War, which really did motivate people, was all about slavery and slavery expansion, and that there was kind of a breakdown of paranoia in the whole political system where people had really ceased to believe that people on the other side had legitimacy, that other views. And that whole fight, I think, including at the grassroots level, was about slavery. So people would often say, wouldn't say I'm fighting for slavery, but I'm definitely against those abolitionists, horrible people on the other side.
Yes, sir. Yes.
He had a question about the Battle of Chickamauga and the role of topography. Well, maybe we should, that's kind of a technical question that actually doesn't deal with either Custer or Grant.
Right.
So we don't have a lot of time. I'm sorry. Well, ask us privately later.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So the question is, what about Grant's progressive views regarding Native Americans? Grant took office at a time when very many people in the United States, especially in the West, believed, well, what was ascribed to Phil Sheridan, that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And that's what a whole lot of people thought, and the closer you got to the Western frontier, the more common that view was. Grant thought that was a bad thing. Grant thought that the American government owed more to the Native Americans than they had been given, and he instituted what was called the peace policy or the Quaker policy. Part of this had to do with figuring out who was going to act as the Indian commissioners. And it's one of the reasons it was called the Quaker policy, because they were drawn from the Quakers. But it also had to do with the idea that there is not necessarily this fight to the finish, that the settling of the West does not have to end with the extermination of the Indians. And so Grant pushed very strongly reservations, the idea that the Indians would be given reservations, which would be theirs, and they could live as they wanted to on those reservations. The problem with that was that every time a reservation was established, then somebody would discover that there was something on the reservation that whites wanted. And this is what led Custer into the Black Hills and to the end of the Custer story.
Yeah, this is an interesting question because, you know, he appointed the first Native American to a major federal post. His military secretary, Eli Parker, was made the first Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He was a man who was of noted lack of prejudice personally, and he really did believe in the equal humanity of American Indians. His first inaugural address states that anything that can be done to make the American Indian a citizen and a full participant in society he favors. The problem with that is that that is an assimilationist viewpoint, which, while very much tied to the whole project of Reconstruction, 14th Amendment initiates birthright citizenship. It basically takes race out of the question of your definition of at least begins to your rights as an American, and makes you a human being in America. That's what entitles you to the respect of the law, due process, everything else. When you apply that to Native Americans, though, as people did, the same Congress in 1871 that passed the Ku Klux Klan Act passed a law saying we will no longer recognize the sovereignty of Indian nations. We will not have treaties that must be ratified by Congress. So they said, we are going to take this bounty of this universalism, and they used it to destroy the group rights of Native Americans. This is a very old idea of liberty that goes back to the Middle Ages, of liberty being a group right, an exemption from the exactions of the sovereign laws. Native Americans were not quite states, and yet they were their own sovereign people. And so this idea that, you know what, you're Americans now, you shouldn't be separate, that came about, and that helped lead to destructive wars. Another aspect of it was, and again, this has nothing to do with any personal animosity on Grant's part, but a belief that they really should be Christians. Grant appointed it was a so-called Quaker policy, because he appointed missionaries, Christian ministers, as Indian agents. We are going to Christianize them. We're going to civilize them. So even the most humanitarian viewpoint at that point did not say, you know what, they're a separate people, they have their own economy, their own way of life, let's let them be. It was, the sort of progressive viewpoint was, let's make them like us. And then finally, a lot of the wars were driven, not surprisingly, not by deliberate attempts to grab their land, though that did happen, but there was a lot of environmental conflict. So even before settlers in the Great Plains got into the territory of the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes and others, they were crossing to the mining country in Denver and whatnot, and they crossed across these river bottoms. The historian Elliot West has written brilliantly about this. So tens of thousands of people and army forts being set up on these river bottoms led to environmental degradation, which made this sustenance of horse herds and huge bison herds impossible. Because during the harsh winters in the high plains, both horse herds and native peoples and the bison herds would shelter in those river bottoms, which are being degraded by people crossing and cutting down the timber, destroying the grazing. So a lot of the climactic, and the same thing with the invasion of the Black Hills. The Black Hills weren't just spiritually important Lakota territory, it was a resource bank, which was critically important to the Lakotas, who were at the height of their power in the 1870s. And so this invasion, these miners coming in, was an assault on one of the material bases of their martial power and of their economy. So there's a lot of complex things that are going on that are beyond public policy. But once you had settlers and people, migrants, getting into Indian territory, there's no question where the Army and where the federal government's going to stand. They're not going to say, oh, well, we should leave. They're going to say, oh, there's fighting, we have to stand up, protect the peace, which means basically forcing Native people off the reservation. So it's a large story of unintended consequences.
I would love to take more questions, but our time is up. We're going to be thrown out of the room. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.
TJ.
I really enjoyed
Yeah.
that. Thank you.